Welcome to the Two Stewards Show. Crime in Canada is a big problem. It's also a big problem in other countries all around the world. In fact, it seems to be a problem wherever it occurs. But today, we aren't talking about crime. We're talking about organized crime. This kind of crime is carefully calculated, well-funded, and constantly flying under the radar of government and law enforcement officials here in Canada. One possible explanation is that the radar mechanisms that Canadian law enforcement officials are using are so old and defunct that they only pick up petty crimes and other slow-moving and somewhat disorganized criminals. A more likely explanation, however, is that the batteries to the radar detection devices were removed decades ago and secretly sold to foreign actors to help cover government deficits. Sadly, experts say that even if Canada did have fully functioning state-of-the-art criminal detecting radar devices, there would likely be too much foreign interference in the signal to get a clear picture of who the real criminals actually are and where they come from. Today, we are talking to Sam Cooper. Sam is an award-winning investigative journalist and best-selling author who has presented his anti-corruption findings to Canadian law enforcement agencies, officials in the Pentagon, financial and legal professionals, and academics. And Mark and I, we want to know, what is the state of organized crime in Canada? What are its effects on our society? And what can be done about it? We talk land transfers, money laundering, CCP influence, economic warfare, and more. To get in touch with the show, visit twostewards.ca. Remember, this show is not financial advice, but is valuable for listening amusement purposes. Now, where did I put those batteries?
Well, we're joined today by the inimitable Samuel Cooper, and Sam, it's your second time on the show with us, so thanks for coming back. Most guests don't come back, but you did, so.
I'm glad to be back with you.
Yeah, it's been a while since we talked, probably, I don't know if it's a year, but 9 months or something anyways, and lots happening in Canada. So if you're listening and you don't know who Sam Cooper is, I mean, get out from under your rock. But Sam is an investigative journalist with a long history in Canada, and now runs his own outfit, The Bureau, and he's wearing the swag today. So you could check that out at thebureau.news, I think is the site, Sam.
Yeah, that's right.
And, there's a lot of good free stuff, and there's also a subscription model. So if you are interested in investigative journalism in Canada, focusing on corruption, this is the place to be. Like, he is the source. He wrote the book, literally. Brent, I think you have it there, right?
Yeah, sorry. I'm with you guys on the show. I'm just kind of immersed in willful blindness over here.
Yeah.
I think I got it. I got it somewhere.
You're in good company. That's being read at high levels in the U.S. government right now, and I get contacted by people in the U.S. government that are following it. So yeah.
When did you write this book?
I wrote it in 2021, and
okay.
Some of the things were still in plausible assertion or thesis form, but I think a lot of your listeners and viewers will know that, over the past year, the U.S. government has gotten very pointed in pointing to Vancouver. And on the cover of the book, you see a graphic of blue fentanyl pills exploding out of the port of Vancouver around the world. Yeah. And famously, FBI Director Kash Patel and others have come out and said in the past year, Vancouver is a weak spot for fentanyl and all the things I've been writing about. So, I'm not saying I'm always right, but I was early and right on this case, and that's why the U.S. government is following me, I believe.
Well, and what amazes me, like, not to take away from your work, Sam, like you're an excellent investigative journalist. I could never do it. But it's not like it was rocket science, right? Like, I look at it sort of as like a paint by numbers, where like you've got the sort of the sketch and the outline. You don't really know what it's like, but you've been outlining it. And it's stuff that most people should, at least in the government, should have known what was going on. It wasn't that hard to paint that picture, not for the average person, but if you're in government anyways. And you took the time and you put the dots together and you've started coloring them in. And now, like you said, you've got the FBI is filling in a lot more. a lot more of these things, and we're getting that picture painted, right? So yeah, all the blue for fentanyl has certainly been painted in, and yeah. So there's a lot we want to talk about here. Maybe we could set the stage quickly, just about organized crime in Canada, and like figure out who are the players. So I think most people in Canada understand that you've got like the Hells Angels. Okay, so I'm I'm from the Hamilton area, so we know like the Hells
Very
Angels
active.
and the Mafia,
Italian,
right?
yeah.
We have a clubhouse that got finally shut down, but it was a fortress. I think it's like a CrossFit gym now. But so people are kind of familiar with that, with the Mafia, and okay, quick story. It just reminds me, Hamilton Mafia.
Yeah.
So my dad, he was a Dutch immigrant, came here in the 50s. He had some adventures, rode his motorcycle across Canada, ended up back in the Hamilton area, had a cleaning business, and one of his clients was Johnny Papalia. And he's not entirely naive, but these Italian guys need their clubhouse cleaned, right? And so he told me the story, and this is how I imagine it. It's like, okay, Dutchie, listen, we got the place here. We want you to clean it. You're going to clean the front. You're going to take out the garbage. You're going to do the ashtrays. The back room, you don't go in. We clean the back room. Okay, you got it? And
Or else.
it's a little a little more Scorsese than it probably was. But anyways, all that to say, that we're familiar with organized crime, with the mob, but their influence, I think, has waned over the last 30, 40 years. But who has taken their place? Because reading your book, it's obvious that organized crime didn't go away. If anything, we're probably in a worse spot, right? So who are the big players in Canada?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think, to your first point, none of this should be rocket science, starting with when you see, unfortunately, the zombies walking around Vancouver that I grew up as a reporter. Why is that? You couldn't deny what was happening there. Now we see it across Canada. And so what has happened is, yeah, people that are in the know knew that the bikers and the mafia, especially in Ontario and Quebec, also across the country, were big players and have been for decades. But in my view, there was always this kind of, Canadian mindset that real corruption and crime is south of the border. We're still good here in Canada. Not too much to see. There's some colorful stuff going on, but it's not that big of a deal. But what you asked me is exactly what I've been working on for a few years and drilling down on. I continue to drill down on. Canada has become a global narco hub. Certainly, we have our problem. Everyone knows we've got a big fentanyl overdose crisis now across the country, started in Vancouver. There's a lot of cocaine coming up here. Of course, we've had BC Bud forever, but we're not geographically a cocaine producing country, of course, but it is flooding up in volumes that can never be consumed in Canada, and has been for decades. So 20 years ago, people like the gentleman your father ran into in Montreal, Hamilton, Toronto, Vancouver, they were the only ones that could bring in cocaine from Latin America and Mexico, along with the bikers. They ran that. Now the Mexican cartels are dealing with. I think there's something like hundreds of serious international organized crime groups across Canada now.
Hundreds.
Getting methamphetamine, cocaine, flooding up from Mexico. As I've reported, the precursors for anything synthetic is coming from China into Mexico and Vancouver. But what has happened here is that we have new players that essentially, you go down to the Yucatan Peninsula and you're going to see a lot of steroid-looking, a lot of big, Caucasian fellows with big arms, wherever you walk along the beach. Those guys are, you could basically call them channels or connectors for the Mexican cartels who now supply across Canada. So the Mexican cartels have taken over. There's increased violence across our country. Memorably, there was a case in Vancouver, Surrey, it's right on the border. They found like 20 Mexican passports, grenades, the fentanyl, precursors, everything. So I just say people are in denial that when the American government says Canada has an increasing problem with Mexican cartels supplied by China, it's happening and it's real. And we have people like our former Canadian Olympian snowboarder, Ryan Wedding, he's on the run, perhaps, still in Mexico. He's become an internationally important global drug trafficker by doing precisely what I'm saying, I'm working on this right now. Most anyone that wants to get Mexican cocaine or meth needs to go through, if not just Ryan Wedding, through a few people like him, and they've become globally important narcos on the distribution level because Canada is very weak on countering organized crime. And that even goes back to the Italian gentlemen. A lot of them were big in New York, and as I wrote my book, An Anti-Racketeering Law, cracked down on Sicilian and Calabrian mafias. They just came up to Hamilton and Montreal even more strongly. That's what's going on in Canada.
So, okay, so we have Sinaloa. You mentioned China. I want to dig into that a little bit more. What about like PRGC, IRGC? What are we seeing from Iran?
Yeah, let me use the Ryan Wedding story again. This massive, brutal, and apparently an incredibly intelligent networker, Ryan Wedding, gets how he rose improbably to become a major cartel figure using Canada. He got close, as I've reported for the Bureau, first, followed by CBC, which I enjoyed their follow coverage. He got close to a very significant Iranian female money laundering figure who's very big in underground banking in Vancouver. He married her while he was in prison. Whether that was a real romantic match or just a strategic connection, I'm saying that Wedding appears to be a brilliant networker. After his career, he suddenly decides maybe he's got the strategic focus of being an Olympian to be good at something else. So he gets close with, I'm saying, Iranian state-backed criminals who are very, very important in this Canadian organized crime landscape, where you have the IRGC and Hezbollah networks working together with domestic, enforcers like Ryan Wedding, all supplied in any case, any synthetic narcotic. China is involved at the top, working with those networks, and the triangle there is Mexico, the most brutal, distributors, enforcers, now embedded in something like dozens of countries around the world, and increasingly Canada. So Iranian state actors working. There's cases where they're working with the Sinaloa cartel through Venezuela, which, by the way, their purported president is under a $50 million wanted sort of action from the U.S. government as one of the biggest narcos in the world. Iran, Hezbollah, is working with Sinaloa through countries like Venezuela and organized crime in Canada. So that's how it works. It's just, as I say, they're using Canada and using it easily.
Yeah, that was my next one, was Venezuela. And I think there's a counter bounty on Trump, I think Maduro announced.
Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah, he may get a visit from special forces pretty soon. Trump just put out an executive order, as you know, empowering the U.S. military to go after designated cartels in foreign lands. So
now, is that just the U.S. military, or is that sort of, I feel like we're almost back to the privateer days? Like, because I thought that also applied to if you're a private group and you manage to pull it off, like, here's the bounty, right?
It's funny you say that. I think probably many will know the name Eric Prince. He's a famous contractor, I believe from the Dutch community in Michigan, some big families there. He has done work for the CIA and the U.S. military. And when Pam Bondi put out that speech saying there's a $50 million reward for Maduro, he tweeted in a reply, should be dead or alive. So what you say there could be. Look, I did a podcast this summer with a former Canadian Special Forces veteran who I happened to train with for, just to stay in shape. And we were talking about how this terror designation on the cartels that Canada has gone along with Washington, I'm sure they didn't want to, that should allow, certainly it now allows U.S. Special Forces. So whether it's, Delta, the Navy SEALs, or shadowy groups we don't even know about, they could be going cross-border. And I argued with my associate from the JTF2, or veteran from that group, Canada should be going active on these cartel fentanyl labs and networks that are working with Iranian threat actors in Canada. And so, I mean, you can envision, and I know this would get the elbows up crowd very excited, but what if Special Forces come across into Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto? I mean, we can envision a world where Canada is supposed to be working together with its fentanyl czar and the American government now.
There's a good one. The fentanyl czar. So what have you? I haven't seen hide nor hair of this feller. Have you heard anything? Anything happening there?
No, I mean, that Canada announced $1 billion and more boots on the ground, and since that was reported, Mark Carney continues to indicate, I would say, the Liberal Party spin that Canada is doing something serious about fentanyl. And in my view, and I talk to people in Canadian units and American units at a very senior level, the people that know in Canada and the United States say it's all performative. Nothing has changed in Canada. The fentanyl czar, I don't know. That's just press release stuff. I've heard about, very performative meetings among senior Canadian law enforcement, after President Trump first made the tariff threats in November. I've heard of big politicians like Doug Ford and beyond meeting Americans. The Americans aren't impressed, and I'll be writing about that more. Nothing's changed here. Hundreds of kilos of narcotics are flooding into Canada to be shipped around the world as we speak. Our government is not working with the Americans who want to cooperate. I'm hearing that cooperation is worse than it's ever been. Canada is just doing its usual passive-aggressive, press release thing. We're on it. I believe the Americans, we're not on it. And as I say, Mexican drugs originally sourced from China are coming up to Canada, and Chinese, Mexican-produced drugs in Canada are flowing down into the States and around the world. Canada's being used.
So what makes it so easy for Canada to be used? Like, do we have loopholes? Like, why is Canada this safe haven for all this stuff?
Yeah, I'll break down a few. Okay, so starting with the ports, the Port of Vancouver, there's well-sourced data that says less than 1% of all shipping containers coming into Vancouver are searched, which is incredible considering the flood of Chinese precursors coming into Vancouver's port and feeding super labs across Canada. The biggest lab ever discovered in the world, a fentanyl super lab in Falkland, BC. Something like 95,000 doses of fentanyl could have been produced there, among ecstasy, methamphetamine, all this other stuff. I'm going to report more, so I won't scoop myself totally, but this involved. Look, I'll tell you this. Here's a mini scoop.
We got a few listeners, too.
Look, it involves the Iranian threat networks, the Chinese threat networks, the Mexican cartels, and individuals in the social sphere of Ryan Wedding, right? So everything I'm talking about focused on super labs in Canada, with precursors flooding into our unguarded ports. Another point on the ports that I reported in Willful Blindness 2021, incredibly, the Jean Chrétien government, 20 odd years ago, removed federal port police from our significant ports. So no one's guarding, right? organized crime is essentially set up with a free run in our ports, and it doesn't make any sense. I've reported further that the Canadian Police Association should be 1997 wrote to Jean Chrétien's trade minister and said, we know Chinese military linked organized crime, Asian organized crime from around the world is using especially Vancouver's port. You need to put the federal port police back in or else. And it hasn't happened. It's just a complete no-brainer. So you talk about loopholes. It's like you have a home and you're trying to keep criminals and you got no back wall. There's nothing there beyond that. Look, that letter I speak about was from the head of the Canadian Police Association. Just days ago, we had Thomas Carrick, the head of the OPP, who's now in that position, coming out at a press conference in Vancouver and saying, we told the government 20 years ago, we need to update our historic laws because they have no capacity to challenge modern transnational organized crime, which is geopolitically connected and which is destabilizing, in a way, our country. Canadian police don't have the tools used. And so there's just yet another example of another Canadian Police Association chief saying that same argument, and nothing has changed for decades. I'll give you one more, getting into the weeds a little bit here, but it's called, because we have a Charter of Rights, two things. One, we don't have an anti-racketeering law, something I wrote about in Willful Blindness. The RICO law is exactly what let the federal government of the United States break down the Italian mafia when it became clear that the Italian mafia was now, in the 70s and 80s in New York, was becoming a government unto itself, not only was running organized crime, but was getting embedded in government activities, contracting, everything. So they developed the RICO law as a hammer, and it worked. Canada doesn't have one. And so some people think that's to do with our Charter of Rights, which I'll give you one more little weedy detail here. We have something called the Stinchcombe ruling. This happened years ago, and what it necessitates is, if you're a Canadian prosecutor on a complex organized crime case, you have to turn over so much of your evidence to the defense side that it entails, giving the defense information about confidential sources, which are basically the way most good police investigations actually get to charges. And so that's a tool that the Americans, the Australians use very freely. Of course, they're not police states. They can do it without, overriding everyone's rights. We can't in Canada. And I can give you so many cases that get brought to prosecutors either don't get accepted or just get dropped, because I think it's an excuse at this point. They say, no, we would have to disclose this information. So that's one of the huge irritants with the United States government and Canada, is that we just don't have the laws, and it doesn't make sense because people are dying so left, right, and center from fentanyl.
So what? Okay, so speaking of prosecution, I mean, I can just imagine being a police officer, being someone either at the lower or the sort of mid level, trying to, like, working a case and doing their job and getting the criminals. And so there's a case of I don't remember her name now, but you've reported on it, a CCP linked scientist in BC.
That's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, maybe give us the quick, because I think this is a very poignant example of what you talk about and we don't know all the details why the prosecutor did what they did, but it illustrates.
That's a huge. I'll break down the details, and I'll tell you that is just the most recent example of any multiple incredibly huge investigations involving these very same networks, especially Mexican, flooding Canada with drugs, using Canada to send drugs out, have been dropped across the country from, BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, right? So this case, the key details here, I didn't name this woman. She's 57 years old. I'll get in a little bit to her background, but the nutshell of the case is a woman is charged for importing and exporting controlled substances. That's all that's said in the charges. June 2022, she appears in court at least 10 times. And then March of this year, the case is just dropped or the proceedings are stayed with no explanation. So this is a concerning factor. I learned what was behind that case. Over 100 kilograms of methamphetamine precursor were shipped from China into British Columbia, and this 57-year-old scientist from a high-level Chinese university who's been in Canada for quite a while was caught, my sources indicated, filling in some of those details that never made it to open court, caught red-handed with a major amount of methamphetamine precursor. And as I say, everyone's focused on fentanyl right now, but the precursors for meth, ecstasy, other synthetic narcotics, it's the same networks and the same threat involved and using Canada. So more about this woman who I call Dr. X. She graduated from a university in China, which is listed in Western intelligence, academic databases as one of these Chinese high threat universities, which has known Chinese security and intelligence funding, known connections to Chinese military operations. And she came to Canada, documents that I found and reported for on the story, under China's 1,000 Talents plan. And this is, the sort of program that has become famous in FBI cases and Western intelligence, that the communist regime sponsors scientists to travel into Canada and the United States, where they get access to our university labs, and they're basically working under the table to, send intellectual property, perhaps work on agro-weapon, genetic materials. There's a case in Michigan. Our Winnipeg lab case connects to this. It's a massive Chinese espionage and some would say hybrid warfare program being enacted. And so it's very interesting that this woman who's caught with precursors is working under that program. More details to that. She was very clearly documented working for many medical marijuana companies in Canada and the United States, shipping, technology, factory parts from China into Canada to be part of these, massive sort of weed extraction businesses that are now, I guess, essentially legal in Canada. But it just points to, I believe, sort of the poly-drug networks connected to Chinese state-connected individuals. And that's what this case speaks towards, and it's just dropped for no good reason.
Yeah, it doesn't leave you with a good, a good feeling about motives in Canada. So, okay, so China is producing tons of precursors, as you mentioned, right? So that the things you need to make drugs, right? The raw chemicals. If anybody ever seen Breaking Bad, I mean, this is like the barrels of blue stuff that they can't get anywhere else. Is there anywhere else in the world that can produce precursors at the level that China can?
No, this has come up in U.S. government investigations, congressional hearings. China is responsible for well over 90% of the precursors for, fentanyl, methamphetamine, ecstasy. To be clear, India has been somewhat connected to this. I believe Pakistan, probably some labs that I believe are connected to the Chinese state on other stories I'm working on are involved. But it's essentially all China, and it's essentially all Chinese state regulated and sanctioned. So my book raised the theory, is there willful blindness or complicity in the Chinese state allowing, organized crime groups to flood the United States with fentanyl? And at that point, I raised it as a plausible theory because I was talking to enough, sources and evidence to say I didn't have a document that said the Chinese Communist Party is willfully wanting to direct drugs into the United States and Canada to kill people. But this is now what the American government is saying. So China, they want fentanyl to be just as allegedly, the Venezuelan president Maduro has now been accused of wanting to flood the United States with harmful drugs, including cocaine-laced fentanyl. This is what the U.S. government is saying, and this is why they have, or President Trump has given clearance for the U.S. military to get involved, because they see this as a type of warfare directed at the United States, ultimately with China right at the top of it.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think one of the telling things is that in China, if you're caught producing these drugs, like, it's not good for you, right? Nobody's going to see you again.
If you're dealing, well, here's the point. If you're dealing to Chinese people, and you're not connected in the right way, you're going to be dead very quick because, politically controlled justice system, death penalty. And it happens. But if you are, as the U.S. government investigations say, dealing those precursors outside China, Beijing gives you a value-added tax. So they're incentivizing it. And there's many other little data points like that showing senior Chinese Communist Party has a direct interest in these fentanyl production factories, including the U.S. government found one in a Chinese state prison. So at this point, it doesn't get any more clear, I think.
So, like, part of the picture, part of the paint by number is more clear. And I think there's some pretty easy things we could do. Like, I don't know, inspect every ship coming from China to the port of Vancouver, right? Would, like, almost a no-brainer. But, for reasons you've mentioned and other reasons we don't know, right? It's just willful blindness. We're not going to do that. Do you know what the value of, I don't know if you know this, I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Like, what is the value of this criminal activity in Canada? Do you know, yearly, roughly?
Well, I was asked to attend a conference for police, leaders recently. It was in Newfoundland this summer, where I, talked about the similar findings that we're discussing today, and my view that Canada isn't serious and hasn't been serious on cracking down on these networks. I raised the theory that there more than willful blindness and government corruption at some levels involved, but a criminal intelligence senior figure speaking, the information I can share, they said the Mexican cartels are $1 billion a day business. I'm not sure if they were referring directly to Canada or worldwide, but said that the cartels are extremely embedded in Canadian cities. They are thriving through corruption and lack of public discourse and scrutiny of this infiltration of the cartels, the Iranian state-backed networks, the Chinese state-sponsored networks, who I'm saying at this point very clearly are interrelated with Chinese intelligence strategically in their drug operations and money laundering operations. Again, the U.S. government is basically saying the same thing. So in Canada, let me put it this way. I, with confidence, reported recently that the money laundering connected to these Chinese-dominated narco networks in Canada has laundered over $1 trillion through Vancouver and Toronto real estate in the past 10 years. And my sources indicate that's a pretty conservative, a good mathematical roundup.
So for reference, Canada's GDP, so all of our economic activity, whether it's government spending or not, was around 2.25 trillion in 2024. I just looked that up. So you're saying, the cartels are doing $365 billion a year, more than the GDP of many countries. We've $1 trillion over 10 years. Like, I'm just wondering if can we afford to crack down on crime in Canada? Because, like, real estate's going south. And I don't know if drugs is the second biggest industry, but it sounds like, and I mean, that's a little bit tongue in cheek, because a lot of that money finds its way into the economy, right? In Canada. And that's mind-boggling, those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, if people want official figures, I believe the Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada has reported something like 125 billion per year money laundering across Canada. I and the people that should know would say that's at least hundreds of billions in this activity. And just through the various kind of financial and court-based reporting I've done on cities like Vancouver, I believe that the prices are it's not about a lack of housing supply or Canadian, legal bank lending. It's about how our financial systems have been captured by transnational criminal linked underground banking to the point where I do believe that these narco networks are the main influence on prices in Vancouver, certainly. And Toronto, it's a bit of a different story, but probably much the same story.
So that's like 125 billion if we take that estimate. That's something like 5% of of GDP, which is like huge. Any industry that produced 5% of GDP in Canada, we would, other than canola, we would be up in arms to protect. So
yeah, and I'll just add that's some good quick math there. But the more and more I reported for the Bureau days ago a story about how Mexican cartels, according to new indictments in Texas, have captured major portions of the oil industry and, stealing through corruption oil from Mexico's state producer and running it through U.S. refineries, selling it around the world. And so my reporting shows that, portions of the legal economy, okay, avocados, seafood, Mexican and Chinese organized crime are just trading, these commodities around the world as a way to, launder drug money and move drugs around the world. So this is why I say these estimates, I believe, that I'm talking about are very low. And so that's when you start to say, I don't think it's tongue in cheek for people in the Canadian government to say, if we really crack down on the way that some of us, in very key positions know how much narco economy has influenced our legal economy, I do think it would be material, meaning, it'll cost, if you really crack down on that, which you cannot afford not to, if you don't want people to keep dropping like flies in our cities, you're trading lives for what I'm saying is very, very gray money filtered all through our economy.
Yeah, this sounds you're shifting away from like a policy failure towards like a moral failure, right? Like,
yeah.
At what point do we shift to that? Like, can we start pointing fingers at people? I guess that's the work you're trying to do, is identify like what's the actual cause here. Like, can a policy fix this? Or is that just like the start of it?
Well, I do believe a policy is the start of it, and good people in the right positions is the start of it. And then it's just military style grunt work of years to reverse this. And at the same time, to build up the economy the way it should have been, based on, and this is not just Canada, it's a worldwide problem. But I do think what we're seeing between Washington and Ottawa is Washington is serious about protecting its people and saving lives and getting hostile state actors and drug dealers out of the legit economy. So let's start with a racketeering law for Canada. As you guys know, a foreign agent registry stemmed out of my work. 2 years later, it's still not implemented in Ottawa. So you ask why. You ask, why don't we have federal port police, back in Vancouver, Halifax, Montreal? I could go on and on, but if you put enough real policies in place, yeah, you can reverse this, but it would take the will. And I do think the more and more I look at this, I have to believe that there's some very powerful people in business and politics that would be implicated in this if we really started overturning the rocks that need to be overturned. And I do think that's a big part of our problem.
So, I mean, I'm looking at your windows behind you, and I see sunlight. And
yeah,
this
I'm
is
a sunny person.
one of the things that you've mentioned in your work, right? what do they say? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Like I think that probably is also a big key because Canadians just don't believe that this is happening. Like the evidence is out there, and I've seen comments either on your stuff or other people's things like on Twitter and so forth, where people are just like, no, it's not true. It's absolutely like you're just making this stuff up. This doesn't happen. It couldn't happen in Canada. It doesn't happen in Canada. And without the will of the people, politicians aren't going to do anything, right? Politicians just reflect sort of the mood of the country. So
I believe that's absolutely true. And it gets me a little worked up that there have been literally stories from the Globe and Mail, calling themselves investigative reporters, saying that Canada's fentanyl problem is exaggerated by the United States and cherry picking, a little figure out of context. And I've done a number of stories showing that I won't go into the details. I think what I want to say is, yeah, Canadians are misled by our supposed newspaper of record and our supposed national broadcaster, CBC. And you just find that politicized reporters that I believe, get their data points from the Prime Minister's office, because I know how it works, and others, write stories that support what Mark Carney comes out and says in a press release. That is, Canada's cracking down on this. Not a big problem here. And I hear from my American sources, and look, I'm a proud Canadian, but I agree with them when they say your Canadian people are not served by a very good or free press. They're getting government talking points. And look, I'm not perfect either, but I'm getting a good and growing lane at the Bureau for hard-hitting, truthful reporting that doesn't just report from Canadian sources, reports from sources around the world to get a more accurate picture. And I believe, what I'm doing is of growing importance because the CBCs and Globe and Mails mostly are pretty politicized. And they do. I point to, because I like to give credit, there's a good reporter, I believe, named Andrew Chen from the CBC that has walked through these very sort of weedy legal things I've pointed to about why, Canadian police, if they put a wiretap on a senior organized crime figure, they have to turn around and tell his lawyer within 90 days that they got a wiretap on him. It's all related to the weakness of our system. And so I'm doing that kind of reporting, but for, I would say, an isolated CBC broadcaster to do, these mini docs and explain to people, look, kudos. Maybe we should keep the CBC around if we have more like that guy, but they're few and far between.
they are. And I mean, I wonder how long this guy's going to last, right? He'll have I imagine he'll have a bit of a leash, and I don't know. We'll see. Maybe we can move to just a different corner of the paint by number picture. So we're getting close on time already. We've just scratched the surface. Yeah. But I want to talk about some of the land transfers that are happening in BC from either Crown land or otherwise that's moving over to BC Indigenous bands. And you had alluded to, I think it's some of your reporting, to Chinese Communist Party influence. And just for our listeners, by the way, we're not bashing China and Chinese people, right? Sure, we all know Chinese and know and love Chinese people that are great Canadians, of Chinese ancestry. They're great Canadians, and whatever. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party and its malign influence on the world. So what is that influence into Indigenous groups in BC? Because that's a new one for me.
Yeah, this is a deep one. So a couple of points. I reported for the Bureau on a document that I exclusively obtained. It's called the NSICOP, National Security Intelligence Panel 2019 Report into Foreign Interference. And it just explains in mind-blowing detail how China has been targeting governments from top to bottom, all levels across Canada, so federal down to municipal, provincial, school boards, and Indigenous bands. One of the stories I wrote was how, CSIS investigations were concerned that First Nations leaders were being flown over to China, wined and dined, and the Chinese play here is, of course, they want to leverage control over First Nations owned land and jurisdiction, which will be very important in many resource deals. And, you know, I'll leave it at that. But you can see how if a foreign power gets next to an indigenous people in any country around the world and says, you're getting a bad deal, we can do better, and starts flooding, the bribes and the money in, very soon they've got a sort of basis of operations there. So in British Columbia, yeah, people are getting concerned that Premier David Eby's government is, with little or no consultation, sort of acting on these unceded land claims that they love to pronounce at every press conference that they go to. Speaking from unceded Tsawwassen Nation land, well, hey, what do you know? A few years later, that land is given to a band. And look, I don't want to get deep into our historic run and details here, but I think that the view is emerging that just for certain, and they tend to be left-leaning governments, to come in and start rapidly handing back lands that, it can, I believe, expose our country to foreign interference through people from China, Mexico, Iran getting into those lands. And one example, I spoke about Tsawwassen. That's a famous case where land, for a band in the Vancouver area was passed back. And, what do you know? A Chinese Communist Party linked billionaire lady from, I'll say, here's a little scoop. Her networks are of interest to the U.S. government and the RCMP, probably more the U.S. government. But, when she builds up a mall on Tsawwassen land after that land is given back to, First Nations control, what do you know? You see the A-team of Chinese organized crime, Chinese consulate officials, Canadian politicians involved in Asian organized crime networks showing up at meetings, for Chinese New Year on the mall, on this land. That's just one example. So other ones I've reported in Ontario, the Six Nations lands around the Ontario-Quebec sort of New York border. Again, major cartel and Chinese Communist Party organized crime activity, working those borderlands. This is a channel for drugs to be moved between the United States and Canada. This is a channel where I've reported that Mexican, we've got bikers on the front end. I've reported behind them, Mexican cartels have built up massive counterfeit tobacco factories on First Nations land, specifically in Ontario, near the U.S. border, even to the point where the Mexican government is complaining that they're getting flooded with Canadian produced cigarettes. Really? And so this is an example how First Nations land, under various degrees of jurisdiction, becomes controlled by foreign-based organized crime. One more thing, as you know, there's the recent explosive, I believe, BC court ruling that gave back a piece of land to the Cowichan Band, which is right on the Richmond sort of waterfront, right in the middle of a bunch of warehouses. I'll speak a little bit to that, but it's just a point where that ruling essentially seems to be affirming what Premier David Eby's government is doing, which is, you're not respecting fee simple private land rights. You're saying, oh, there's a prior claim to that land and we're going to give it back. And information is emerging that the government of BC has not used its strongest arguments. So maybe just following in line with David Eby's sort of political move there. But I will add, I am interested in that, exactly where that ruling impacts. It's right in the middle of a bunch of warehouses and on the Richmond waterfront and Fraser River that are central for Chinese organized crime, narco activity. So I start to wonder, that doesn't mean they're behind that in any way. But if that land goes all the way back to, the Cowichan Band, look who's their neighbor. I'm saying it's the people that are flooding Vancouver's port and Canada stepping out of the way.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, you don't have to You don't have to out and out say it or prove it, but I mean, most reasonable people, if you have A and C, like B is in between that, that's the thing that makes sense. Because I didn't, when I was originally reading about, some of these land giveaways or, whatever you want to call it, transfers. And, I'd be interested to see if there's maybe another band that has a prior claim to the bands that have claims now, how we would work that out. But yeah, to see how this all works out. I mean, with just on the land acknowledgements, I mean, I've made fun of them for a long time, and just as as virtue signaling.
I've got a story for you.
Okay, yeah, you give me this story.
Well, I was asked to do a Zoom meeting. This was during the pandemic, and it was about my knowledge on sort of, the real estate markets and how influenced are they by what I'm talking about, money laundering. And it's all a bunch of good, university type people. And when they introduced themselves, they were like, speaking from the unceded territory of Algonquin, blah, blah, blah. My turn came up and I was like, I don't know what unceded territory am I speaking from, nor would I say that I'm speaking from an unceded territory. So I'm Sam Cooper, a journalist, and I was just left out in the cold in that little social circle.
Yeah, that's a cup of cold water, a glass of cold water for sure. I mean, so yeah, but my point was it's just virtue signaling, because you could say that I'm speaking from unceded territory, but the the hidden message is like, and we're we took this land, if that's how you look at it, and we're not going to give it back, but we're at least just saying that it did belong to them. It's just like a real backhander, but in this case, they're actually now going that one step further, it seems like, and ceding that land.
And that brings to mind, I mean, the language is important, I believe. I've talked about, I focus more and more on Premier David Eby because of his decisions with BC Ferries, giving that $1 billion deal to China. The land, the fact that Kash Patel is pointing to Vancouver as a huge problem, and David Eby and his government say, no, fake news. I've reported on David Eby and his Chinese community advisor, who I found it very interesting in messages to me, uses that same unceded land claim sort of language, the virtue signaling. And I think, well, yeah, maybe for China, it's a little bit more than virtue signaling. Maybe it's part of their intelligence play.
So, yeah. Sam, where do we find the people with a backbone and a moral compass to kind of turn the ship around?
I like the sunny window frame behind me. I try to find the bright side as much as I can. And I like to say I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't believe that the ship can be turned around. At the same time, I do believe on the course we're starting to go under. So, and
does that go down to like Canada's democracy too? Like,
Canada's democracy. I don't know, Christian singers, wherever they come from, being run off the stage while, Islamist protesters are given a free walk in the park. I don't think this stuff is very accidental. I do believe, I've always, not to ramble, but I've always tried to stay away from the culture wars and being like, I'm just a, straight up legal, investigative, financial reporter. But more and more, I learned that there are foreign nations that are feeding this sort of social culture wars and playing very much what we're talking about. Things like Canada's historic wrongs with the First Nations will absolutely be leveraged by Chinese intelligence. I have key evidence on that, where they will use, whether there's, grave sites found in British Columbia, as we all know, still unproven. They will take that and say, Canada, you cannot accuse us of a genocide in Xinjiang. You're very guilty of, burying little children. So, I mean, my broad point here is that it goes across the board from social operations to financial, criminal operations, election interference from countries like China and Iran. And I could list so many by now and tell you what's going on in our cities and streets in Canada is very influenced by foreign organized crime and foreign nations. So to your question, Brent, I mean, it takes people that have the backbone, I would believe, of people, whether they be in Canada's context, hard-nosed hockey players in their past, military, law enforcement. They got to get into politics and tell people what they know from their own, talking now about law enforcement. These men and women know so much more about what's going on in Canada that they can say. And I guess part of my growth as a journalist has been I've learned to investigate through different channels what they do, find the same things, and become a trusted person that they can share with, and so I just have sometimes it's a dark view of what's going on in Canada, but at the bottom there's a source of faith that cannot turn away from it, that will always, at least speaking for myself, I have to keep doing what I do. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and hope that more Canadians, read it, assess it for themselves. If they believe it, get politically involved. And, at the end of the day, this will be about elections and politicians doing what Canadians tell them to do. And if that's, putting a racketeering law in place, putting federal police back in Vancouver's port, because Sam Cooper at the Bureau said that's clearly lacking. He has said numerous Canadian Association police chiefs point to the same things. He's not making it up. They're not making it up. Why don't you do it? If enough people get involved like that, we will have the right leaders. But as you say, Mark, if you don't, I'm very afraid that there's too many people in politics that are very much in on this. Yeah.
So, yeah, that was well said, Sam. And so, yeah, hard-nosed hockey players, yes. Snowboarders, not so much.
Mark and I are going to go down to some ports and inspect some containers after this.
Yeah.
I want to respect your time, Sam. I know you got going, but one quick thing, incidental. I don't know. Mark Cahodes, I think I'm pronouncing it right. He's a sort of a famed short seller in the States, and I've seen you guys have interacted, I think on Twitter. Like, do you know him? Do you interact with him, or is that just a Twitter thing?
Yeah, I've known Mark Cahodes for a long time, since 2014. The short story here is he got rich by exposing frauds, as you know, finding criminality in stocks and betting on the other side. He's not always right. I don't always agree with him. His rhetoric is very, very spicy and fiery. In some ways, I would say, if you talk to him, we share a lot of thinking. I don't share his style of conversation or rhetoric, and I'm in a different lane. But, he contacted me when I started breaking stories about what's wrong with Vancouver real estate being taken over by foreign organized crime. He was very interested in mortgage fraud in Ontario in a different lane. He reached out, we started sharing notes, and I think we both would say, we both suspected that international organized crime was very much involved in mortgages across Canadian cities, but we underestimated by far how deeply involved and how true, our at times suspicions and theories later becoming findings were. So, yeah, that's him. And Mark's a good friend, and we do talk, privately on the phone as well as back and forth on Twitter now and then.
Okay, that was just a personal question, really, for me. But it's interesting. I mean, if we could find out, I don't know if Mark could help us figure out how to short the government of BC or the government of Canada, for what eventually comes. Maybe that would be.
No, I mean that is
one solace.
That's a good joke, but there's reality to it. And the short story on that is both Mark and I, were kind of fans of David Eby when he was an opposition politician, and to the point where Mark got very close with David Eby and met him privately a number of times, as Mark and I have talked about on podcasts. And then when Eby got in power, he just went south. And I've said a number of times recently, I just think it would take the politician of the utmost integrity to become BC Premier and turn it around, because structurally by now, this is how China works. They flood a zone with money and corruption. This is how they destabilize and take over, South Pacific, Latin American nations, where they basically own the governments. And I say, to a large extent, the same thing wildly is happening in British Columbia.
Yeah, maybe Brad West. I think the
I agree.
CCP hate him already, right? So
yeah, I talk with Brad West privately as well. I have said Brad West would be a tremendous fentanyl czar and should be. He's the, Brent, to your question, yeah, we need people like Brad West at senior positions in Canadian governments. And I do think people like that could turn it around. I'm not planning to go into politics, but I have said, honestly, if a fentanyl czar wanted to talk to me, I would give my services for free.
I'm guessing, awesome. I'm guessing he hasn't yet.
Yeah, no phone ringing from whatever his name is, Brousseau. Yeah,
still waiting for that phone call. Okay. Okay, this has been quite the trip, quite the paint by numbers excursion. So thank you again, Sam. Brent, do you have any final questions?
No, it's great to hear that we're not past the point of no return in Canada. We can get some people in there. So
yeah.
Appreciate the work you do on this as well.
Yeah. So where can people find you, Sam?
Yeah, so you go to thebureau.news. That's on Substack, and I have now 30,000 non-paying subscribers and enough paying to keep me going, including legal fees. So people go over to thebureau.news and become a subscriber, hopefully paid. And I have to say, Substack has been a great home for me for 2 years. This is an example of a new media company that supports free speech in a way that I'm afraid is lacking in Canadian journalism. So I've now taken my reporting on Canada and beyond Canada to Substack. And they're now, that's a very good team. At times I was going to build my own website and still could, but Substack is working very well for me. So Substack, thebureau.news, and you can find me on Twitter at Scooper Cooper.
Okay. And I'm guessing have you gotten your government subsidies yet, or they're not made their way to you?
One time I got a note from the CRTC, so they know I'm out here, and I said I'm a sole person. I have some contributors. Basically, I don't know why you're contacting me, and no, I do not get any subsidies. I pay my taxes, and look, I may be a lot more American-based in the future corporately because. But I'll always be a Canadian and reporting on Canada within the world context.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And yeah, at least hit them up on Twitter, guys. Great follow if you're into, or on X if you're into that sort of thing. So thank you so much, Sam. We appreciate your time. And to our loyal listeners,
steward your wealth wisely. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Two Stewards Show. If you like my voice better, click subscribe.
If you like my voice better, click share.
If you like both, give us a 5-star rating.
To learn more about the show, head on over to twostewards.ca and explore our free resources. To interact with the show, feel free to reach out at hello@twostewards.ca.
We will see you in the next episode. In the meantime, steward your wealth wisely.
Nailed it.